going off mute. Share your camera if you're comfortable. We can get things kicked off.
Can you see us?
We can. Hey, Jamil, good morning.
Good morning.
And good afternoon as well.
So let me share the screen. And let me know if everyone can see on the slideshow mode.
We can.
Perfect. Should I close these windows or can I keep that open?
You're good. We just see the main presentation.
Perfect. Awesome. Maybe we can start now. Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to panel discussion on material compatibility database for immersion cooling. So it's great, right? We are having advanced cooling solutions presentations one by one, and we kicked off with the ACS discussion and welcome by Rolf Brink. He mentioned about our activities. And then we had the Jessica Goldbrand, who presented on the IT gear design guidelines for IT gear document white paper activities. And now we are going to talk about a new venture that our immersion cooling workstream is leading on. It's about material compatibility database for immersion cooling. So it is going to be a panel discussion, and we have some esteemed guests in our panel, some leading experts from different areas of the industry. And for first 10 minutes, we will be discussing about the background of this effort. And then after that, we will start with the panel discussion. So there will be a question and answer session after we have listened all of the panelists' presentations, and questions can be submitted by typing them into the public session chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. We encourage you to ask your questions as you think of them. Please do not wait until the end. Also, please note which panelist the question is for. So we will be asking generous questions to our panelists about this effort. So to start with this, so I'm Jimil Shah. I'm an application development engineer at 3M EMSD Lab, mainly working on data center cooling, particularly liquid cooling applications, including direct-to-chip, two-phase direct-to-chip, and single-phase and two-phase immersion cooling applications using fluorochemicals. And I have Eduardo D. Azevedo, who is the product application specialist from Shell. So for today's agenda, we will be talking about different white papers in the workstream because it's a fairly a new group. And we just had 2 community meetings as well as 2 focus group meetings. So we have just defined our objectives and the scope. We are still working on defining the work packages, and we will be seeking some expert advices from our panelists on how can we drive this effort. So then we will be discussing about the focus group who have agreed on joining this group, then objectives and the considerations that we are particularly considering with regards to solutions as well as fluids, then scope, and then we will kick off the panel discussion. So as Rolf mentioned during our ACS welcome call, and so Rolf Brink from Espetas, he's the lead for this immersion cooling work group, and under his leadership, we have accomplished quite a bit in last 2-3 years. We have immersion requirements white paper, which is published. We have immersion requirements revision 2, which is in progress. And as Jessica Goldbrand just presented on the effort on design guidelines for immersion cooled IT equipment white paper, which is being wrapped up, and we are expecting to present that in front of IC next month. So this is the focus group. So again, I would like to thank Rolf Brink for the opportunity. And you can see this is the only OCP platform where 2 leading chemistry fluid manufacturers from hydrocarbon arena like Shell and fluorochemicals 3M, they are working together hand in hand and leading this effort to I would say share the information in the industry to increase the knowledge of immersion cooling and enable the technology.
Good.
So this is our focus group where Jessica Goldbrand, Nigel Gore, Rolf Brink, Jack Kohler, Diego, Brandon, Peter Cooper, and Rolf, Rick, Cheyenne, and Eleanor, and John Bain. These are the focus group people from different industries like Intel, Vertu, Aspeta, Stas, Alpha Level, GRC, Submer, Chain.io, and MI Materials, who are like working in using different fluids, different types of solutions, and we are working together and trying to achieve the accomplish this task. So the objectives for this presentation is frame of. So for this work group, I would say the objectives are: we want to create the frame of reference for validating the components, test definitions. So this is not about a problem statement. This is about a failure. So we want to work on some globally accepted test methods which can provide us reproducible results that can be based on the experience of the fluid manufacturers, can be the experience of the server ODMs and OEMs and vendors, tank manufacturers, and the end users. So we can use the existing test methods, or we can modify that as per our needs, or we can use the new methods. We want to create the database of tested equipment, important for designing the system, and material compatibility related to different fluids. So here we are trying to cover, because there are certain ambiguities pertaining in the industry regarding multiple fluids available, and particularly ODMs and OEMs and end users and component manufacturers, they are not sure which fluid do they need to taste and which method do they need to use to validate those components in different systems. So here we are, it's a huge task, and we are trying to define different work groups. So ultimately, we are planning to have harmonized frame of reference, which is which can include all, I would say, major components and major fluids available in the market. Solution considerations. So we are considering major fluids being used for immersion cooling and different solutions available in the market. So for fluids, hydrocarbons and fluorochemicals, solutions like single phase, two phase, clamshell, tank style cooling with different heat transfer modes like nature convection, forced convection, and nuclear boiling convecting modes. The scope of this work group is to have a matrix. We want to be impartial and inclusive. We are going to talk about the physics. We want to teach and explain the methods. We want to create the reference database to select components compatible for immersion specifically and supported by the manufacturer. And we want to have the comprehensive view of all compatibility issues. And we will be asking our experts what would they like to see in the database, and do they prefer a white paper or a database, or which kind of folder do they want to create. So with this background, I would like to call to action. So please join Immersion Workstream, as Jessica mentioned earlier, Rolf mentioned earlier. Please join Immersion Workstream and contribute. I already mentioned about the documents. Here are some wiki links of this ACS immersion schedule. We have the call on every third Tuesday of the month. For this particular focus group, we have call every first Tuesday of the month. So please send an email to Rolf, me, or Eduardo, and let us know if you and join the regular ACS immersion work group, as well as show your interest in joining our material compatibility effort. So with that, I would like to kick off the panel discussion. We have some leading experts from the different areas of the industry. First, we have Eduardo D. Azevedo, who is also the co-lead for this work group. Then we have Hussain Alisa from Microsoft. We have Philip Tuma from 3M, and we have Rob Curtis from Dell Technologies. So our first panelist is Eduardo. So Eduardo is a product application specialist at Shell Global Commercial Technology based in Hamburg, Germany. He currently leads the R&D efforts of the Shell immersion cooling fluid for computer data centers and synergies related to material compatibility. As a mechanical engineer with more than 24 years total experience in multinational companies, combined with IT and engineering background in different locations, Brazil and Germany, he is working with Shell Technology and R&D team to develop cleaner, innovative, and sustainable cooling fluids and solutions for the data center industry. And I would say it's quite of an achievement to be that young and smart after 24 years of experience. So Eduardo, floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining.
Hey, Jimmy, thank you very much for the kind introductions. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes, all good.
Yes. Okay. Good. Thank you. So thank you very much for the kind introductions. It is because in Brazil it was allowed to start working when it was 14, so that's why for 24 years. So good morning, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. It's a pleasure to me represent Shell and also working very close to Jamil and also our colleagues from these big players in this industry on the material database compatibility. So, and also a big thank you for the OCP community. And Shell just joined the OCP membership this year, but I must say that it's been an amazing journey opportunity, this collaboration, okay? So if you move to next slide, Jamil, please. So this is only a cautionary note that reminds us to not use the information these presentations are based for any trading activities. So I trust that this is clear. Jamil, next slide, please. Right. So so when we start to discuss about this, about our efforts and compatibility, so we put some more brains together. So well, why we should focus on material compatibility, right? So in our view, it's because it's a complex topic. We have different fluid chemistries, as Jamil mentioned before, and we have also multiple IT manufacturers and material technologies, everything together. And then we have different standards or multiple compatibility test methods being adopted currently. We also see it's a very important topic due to intrinsic relation between the fluid and the IT immersed parts. And through focusing on the material compatibility, we can prove or improve the equipment reliability by understanding the possible failure modes, right? With the main objective is to keep the IT equipment operating properly as designed. For example, in the picture, you can see a typical GTL, which is a gas to liquid molecular structure, which is based on Fischer-Tropsch process. And we just put this here to illustrate that and to remind us that the molecular structure of the fluid, it's important to determine the fluid characteristic, but also to has influence on the level of the affinity that the fluid has with the different materials immersed, right? So we believe that collaborating with OCP, development partners, and the industry is now more important than ever before to bring awareness to the technology and good practice sharing. Okay, Jamil, next slide, please. Yeah. So in this slide, we listed some examples of analysis applied to understand the compatibility of different materials. So on the left side, you see that we a particular experiment that we took some plastics, elastomers, metals, and multiple parts were immersed under controlled temperatures and for a determined period of time. And then the component weight and volume was measured very precisely. We observed then some materials have a very low or almost imperceptible variation, whereas some present a little bit more. And by working with the component suppliers in this case, this kind of experiment can help in the material selection for a specific part. This is where we work with on the compatibility work stream as well. We'd like also to focus to streamline this kind of test as done in this example in this graphics. So in this example in the graphics, we see some components like polycarbonate, polyamide, and also epoxy reeds, which commonly used in some connectors or pipings or parts of the what we can see in the immersion environment. And on the right side, we can see some examples where we can use our fluid analytics capability to investigate the immersion cooling properties after the immersion experiment. So for example, in the infrared graphic, where we can see some traces of AVA, which is ethylene vinyl acetate, through the spectrum comparisons. And also in the ICP, which is the inductor coupled plasma test, we could see a very low concentration of silicon, for example. And this data and techniques, and that's why I try to put like in two different columns. As they associated, they can help us understand and identify the traces of any compound or material in the fluid. But more than that, especially to demonstrate that the fluid physics and chemical and thermal performance is maintained even after the test, even the customer data, information, and confidence that the equipment performance and operation is safe. Okay, so with that said, I think I would like to hand over to Hussain. I think Hussain is the next one. Am I glad to keep the discussion on the panel? Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Eduardo. So our next panelist is Hussain Alisa. So Hussain is a technical lead working for Microsoft's Data Center Advanced Development Team with focus on next generation technologies for hardware and infrastructure, with a background in data center server thermals, performance, and architecture, and more than 50 publications in the field. His work has received multiple recognitions, including New York State Assembly Early Career Achievement, ASME 2018 Interpack Outstanding Paper Award, IEEE TCPMT Best Paper Award, and S3IP Distinguished Dissertation Award. Hussain is a member of IEEE ASHRAE TC 9.9, ASME, and Open Compute. So Hussain, floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Jamil. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you okay.
Okay, great.
Let me move the slide and just
yes,
for a second, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, if you can move to the first slide. Okay. Thank you, everyone. So great to be here, and it's a great topic to be discussing. One thing I wanted to mention when it comes to certification and material compatibility for immersion is that really this isn't unique for liquid immersion technology. I mean, if you look at it historically, we've been doing material compatibility qualification and testing for air cooling. A very famous example is board coating and material selection when it comes on how to deal with air cooling when basically you have airborne contaminants and moisture, and trying to select the appropriate set of material to avoid creep corrosion, for an instance. Similarly, compatibility discussion can be expanded to direct to chip liquid cooling. And Jamil, if you can move to the next slide. So for example, just through the discussion of direct chip cooling with cold plates, whether it's the list of wetted material, the use of copper versus aluminum, concerns about galvanic corrosion, selection of compatible coolant and material, whether it's water or PG. So I wanted to highlight that as we start, that compatibility requirement is not unique to liquid immersion, but perhaps the effort to standardize it is a recent one. And it's great to see OCP doing all that. I'm gonna echo some of the sentiments in the previous talks as well by Jessica and Rolf. So basically, immersion fluids can be categorized based on thermal properties. So based on their heat transfer mode, whether it's if we're talking about single phase, which we can have natural or forced convection, or when we go to two phase and we are talking about boiling at obviously lower temperature. We can also have a classification based on the chemistry of the fluids, which is break them down into hydrocarbons and all the subcomponents or subcategory there of, you want to call it mineral oil esters, different synthetics. And then the second chemical classification could be the families of fluorinated or PFCs. And just having this classification really helps as we go forward into defining a qualification process for each. From a hyperscaler and end user perspective, an ideal immersion fluid should be, first of all, should be safe to handle. That's very important, of course. Second is we need to have the appropriate dielectric constant. We want to ensure that across the board, from the FPGA to the CPU to everything in between, that we don't have, we're not impeding signal. So signal integrity and dielectric strength is very important. Obviously, stability is the heart of things, making sure that the fluid doesn't have first order or second order compatibility challenges that can lead to short-term or long-term failures. And then we can talk about cost of the fluid, obviously, ensuring that the fluid is sustainable and eco-friendly, ensuring that the fluid is easy to handle in operation and doesn't give nightmare to the operator. And then if it's a two-phase fluid, then the boiling temperature needs to be right. And the list really can go on with many favorable characteristics of immersion. The second thing I wanted to touch on is when we want to go into a qualification process. As I mentioned earlier, doing the categorization of single phase versus two phase, PFC versus hydrocarbon, and then looking at what's unique in a qualification and certification process about each and what's common. So the end result is a spec that component manufacturers can apply in their lab. Another thing I wanted to highlight is it would be great that out of this work thread that we have actual component certification programs. So now you really take it to the component supplier, from the CPU to the capacitor and everything in between. And then, what comes out of it is a list of qualified components with also defined warranty conditions, erroneous acceleration curves, and all these important factors. So this is a great thread, and happy to be joining you today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Hussain, and we really appreciate your insights. And we are very much interested in working with you on all the challenges that you are observing in your facilities, as well as to try to solve all the challenges, and we can work towards deploying and implementing this technology in a wider scale. So our next panelist is Philip Tuma. So it's my immense pleasure to introduce my industry mentor, Phil Tuma. So Phil Tuma is an application development specialist in the Electronics Materials Solutions division of 3M Company. He has worked for more than 25 years developing applications for fluorinated heat transfer fluids in various industries, including military and aerospace electronics, supercomputers, lasers, pharmaceutical, and semiconductor manufacturing. I swear these are very few names. He has worked on more than thousands of applications, I would say. For the past 10 years, he has focused on immersion cooling in data centers and pioneered the use of two-phase or evaporative immersion cooling with 3M fluorochemical heat transfer fluids. So Phil, floor is yours.
I wasn't sure if I unmuted myself or if you managed that. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for listening to my talk. Next slide, please. First thing I'd like to say, when you consider fluorochemical material compatibility, the primary effect that the fluid can have on a material, those kinds of interactions with fluorochemicals are pretty rare. And that's because the polymers and materials that comprise a typical computer are predominantly hydrocarbon. And fluorinated fluids don't have any real affinity for them. So if you look at, if you were to do a standard ASTM soak test, for example, with an adhesive or an elastomer, you'd rarely see any major incompatibility. And so we're able to use common thermal interface greases and things like that in immersion cooling applications. But that doesn't mean fluorochemicals are free of their issues. There are a lot of extractable substances in a modern computer system. And these materials can come into the fluid and then they can migrate to other materials. We call this a second order or secondary compatibility. So for example, you could have, and this happened at Cray many years ago, you could have a hose that's heavily plasticized. The oil that's in that hose is not very soluble in the fluid, maybe only 100 parts per million. but it can use the fluid as a vector to migrate into an adhesive, for example, and cause the adhesive to swell and delaminate. And this happened at Cray. And so in single phase applications, these issues are extremely rare, but they can happen. And so it's important to understand the ways that they can happen. Two-phase applications are categorically very different because we have distillation, a boiling mechanism that's present that isn't in single-phase applications. For example, the vapor that's generated during the boiling process is freshly distilled and has a high affinity for contaminants. So it can be very efficient at extracting materials from, for example, polymer C, which you see in the figure at right. You also have boiling surfaces, of course, the processor, FETs, voltage regulators, diodes. These things are all boiling, and a modern processor can distill hundreds of liters of fluid per day. So the contaminants that become solubilized by the fluid can deposit there, and this can affect not only thermal performance, but in extreme cases, it can affect the reliability of the device. Next slide, please. Now, the way we get at these kind of second order interactions and understand contamination is with a technique called this oxide extraction, which is a technique commonly used to extract extractable materials from foodstuffs. But we pioneered its use many years ago for compatibility testing. And I don't want to elaborate too much on the details, but it uses freshly distilled vapor to extract from a material as much material as you possibly can as quickly as possible. And it allows you to see separately the effect of fluid on the material. Will the fluid diffuse into the material, for example, and also allows you to isolate and analyze what comes out. So this is going to be very important when you're honing filtration strategies. And that points to my last point related to fluid filtration. You know, when we sell a fluorochemical fluid, it's very pure. And in order to be able to ensure that it's going to behave the way we intend, we like to keep it pure. And so we will typically clean the fluid in situ. And activated carbon is a very good way to do this. It'll effectively scrub contaminants, plasticizers, things like that. In practice, it's less important in single phase applications, and I can't honestly think of a single phase user that rigorously filters their fluid. But it's extremely important for two-phase applications for the reasons I mentioned. The oils and contaminants can distill out on boiling surfaces and affect thermal performance at the very least. And that's where I'll wrap up.
Great. Thank you so much, Phil, for sharing your information, and we are looking for the question answers on this. Rob, Robert Curtis is our next panelist, and Rob has spent the last 12 years at Dell and has 17 years total experience in blade and rack server thermal design, architecture, and strategy. Rob currently leads R&D efforts to develop next generation cooling technologies and strategies for the Dell PowerEdge server portfolio. As IT component powertrains and system densities continue to drive the need for new cooling solutions at both the system and data center level, Rob is investigating alternative cooling technologies such as advanced air cooling, direct liquid cooling, and single and two-phase immersion. So, Rob, the floor is yours.
All right.
Thank you for
Thanks thank you for the introduction, Jamil. Go ahead to the next slide. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, just making sure. All right, go ahead, one more. So immersion cooling at Dell. So from the Dell side of things, we've had multiple teams investigating immersion cooling, both single and two-phase, over the past 8 or so years. And this is across different teams at Dell, in our server and in our hyperscale divisions. And these efforts have grown in scope. You know, I think most folks are aware that the CPU memory storage accelerator power trends have significantly peaked up in the past few years. And we have an increased cooling challenge within our systems. And that's where immersions come in as an alternative cooling technology that we're pursuing to understand where that fits into our cooling portfolio. So we are working with multiple customers on immersion cooling applications for our server systems. These are, customers that are interested in immersion technologies, both single phase and two phase. And so we're working with them to understand how we can put Dell hardware into these immersion type systems. In the past, as I mentioned, the thermal challenges that we're facing, the studies have focused mostly on the thermal performance of these immersion applications. We've studied oil quite extensively and continue to oil immersion in a single phase systems, and have ramped up our two-phase immersion studies over the past few years. Working with folks like Phil and others in the industry to better understand the phenomena that goes on in those two-phase systems. I think, though, as we continue to explore immersion, our studies will shift more from understanding the thermal performance and the cooling performance of the technology to more of the reliability and materials compatibility aspects of those. And so we have quality and reliability studies that are kicking off soon around these technologies to engage our reliability and quality experts, help them to understand what we want to go do, what the performance is, what the these phenomena like Phil mentions with the material compatibilities, and the material interactions and the different tank-based immersion platforms. Go ahead to the next slide. So why is material compatibility important to Dell? So quality, reliability, and signal integrity are paramount and must not be sacrificed. So this means, we're a hardware provider. We're selling to many customers, and we cannot allow our systems to fail because we didn't do our due diligence to validate that the hardware is compatible with these materials and these technologies. So we've got to understand, all of the different fluids. There are many options out there in both single phase and two phase. So we've got to study those, understand their chemistries, understand how they interact with the hardware materials. I describe it as a recipe, right? You especially in immersion, where you think about putting things into a tank, right? You've got hardware. You've got sheet metal, you've got boards, you've got heat sinks, and all of the materials that comprise all of those components. And you've got the fluid. And in two-phase systems, you have the gas as well. So how all of these things go together, interact, and produce a result that is desirable, right? From a thermal performance, reliability, long life solutions. That's the goal that we're pursuing, is to be able to have that recipe that is known, and established and followed across the industry. And so we see collaboration through OCP as a means to achieve this goal, especially on a shorter time scale. Similarly with DLC, where we're doing direct liquid cooling with cold plates, the industry ramp has been slow. There are DLC groups within OCP as well that are working to standardize many things, and I think and hope to see the immersion and material compatibility work stream follow in their footsteps. From an OEM perspective, the materials may require changes to how we design our systems, right, to achieve that correct recipe, so that everything works in conjunction and achieves that high reliability solution, right? We're talking about cables, power cords, capacitors, resistors, adhesives, glue, labels, paint, ink, seals, gaskets, solders, all of that stuff, and many more materials. So we may have to change the way we make up our systems to operate in these immersion technologies. So I think if every OEM works separately in their silo, it's going to slow down adoption, and things are going to take a lot longer. And then we have risk of competitor systems with non-compliant materials, right? If you think about a tank full of IT gear at, let's just, whatever company is using that immersion system, right? If they put in a non-compliant, some hardware with a non-compliant material, you're putting all of the hardware in the tank at risk by mixing the hardware that's not compliant with that known good recipe. So that's definitely a concern. And another reason that we're engaged with this OCP group in hopes of seeing some sort of a standard or a documented recipe of materials and fluid compatibility. On the customer side of things, they're going to want a warranty that is no different than it is for air-cooled systems. And so that's something that we want to be able to provide through the material compatibility work stream. And then customers must be informed and trained on how to properly maintain their materials, maintain their immersion systems, whether it's filtering, changing filters, or sending fluid samples off to external labs to be analyzed to ensure that over time the fluids aren't becoming contaminated or otherwise incompatible. And then, I think another thing that customers may require is some sort of industry certification. That you've got things like Energy Star and other certifications that gear can be validated to support. I think that's an opportunity here where you could say this hardware is guaranteed or validated, follows these guidelines. And is compatible with these immersion type solutions. That way you don't get into those concerns or those issues where you're mixing hardware vendors and have the potential for contamination because of materials that aren't part of the known good and validated recipe. And that includes my slides. Welcome any questions.
So great information, Rob. And you rightly mentioned the last point that the customers may require a certification, and that is one of the biggest push behind this work group. So thank you so much for sharing your information and the expertise. I would like to thank all the panelists. So let's start for the question and answers. I have some questions for the panelists, and then let me stop sharing the screen so that the audience can see the panelist who is answering. So I'm stopping to share, and the first question is for Rob because you just presented. So let's start from your perspective. So what would be the main outcome expected from the material database for immersion cooling workstream efforts, or what would you like the group to focus on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I'm going to reference DLC again because that's something that we've been working with for quite a while, and there's been quite a bit of work on the industry side from within DLC. One of the things that's been published in multiple, by ASHRAE, Intel has a liquid cooling design guide, is a set of wetted materials that are approved, wetted materials that are prohibited. And so I think something similar for immersion cooling would be exceptional, right? A list of known materials to avoid. These materials cause problems. And obviously with the multiple fluids, with single phase and two phase, you've got to have some sort of a cross-reference. So, I imagine a matrix with a list of the immersion fluids, cross-reference with the list of, materials that are known good, known to cause problems, so that folks that are designing systems can have that as a quick reference. These are known bad materials. We have to avoid these. These are another set of materials that may be compatible with single phase but not with two phase. We need to understand how the different chemistries and the different fluids interact with all of the materials that we're putting into the tank. So I think that's kind of the number one for me, as we get into potentially designing hardware specifically for immersion. We need that known, as it goes back to the recipe that I talked about. We need that known list of materials that are good and that are bad.
Right. So that's a great feedback. Just to add in that, Phil, as you mentioned, that primary compatibility might not be the might not be everything, right? So as just Rob mentioned, that the list of vetted materials. So I think that that's not the end of the material compatibility database, right? We need to also consider the system effect and all that. So can you provide your perspective on that? Can you add something on that too?
Sure, Jamil. I think that is the challenge. If you do primary compatibility testing, as we've done and for many customers over the years, we don't often see very much interaction, but you put it into the system where there are myriad other materials, all containing contaminants that can get into the fluid. They can start to interact with one another. And so it's really difficult to arrive at, what would classically be called a compatibility chart per se. We take the stance that it's better to educate people or to help them understand how these materials can interact and look at the ways they can do that, and then maybe assess a material's likelihood of interacting with other materials based upon what you see in laboratory compatibility tests.
Great. So I have a question for Eduardo. Like, how important do you see material compatibility in your immersion cooling developments or applications, or your experience with your vendors and customers?
Hi, Jimmy. It's a great question. I would say that it's become one of the most important subjects in this area. Or I've just listened to Jessica's presentation before. She used it like the material compatibility is the foundation, right, for this application, which is, I think, is the word I was looking for. And that explains, I think, highlights how important it is, right, for this, for us, and also for this application. As I mentioned before, we see as a complex topic, and we could, as Phil just mentioned, if you have considered hundreds of different components immersed, each one made with multiple materials compositions, right? And it's as Rob mentioned, it's hard but possible to find this recipe. That's what we're looking for. And a comment aside would be like, it's known the benefits that this disruptive and innovative technology brings to the customers, right? In attaining the high power density, demands, efficiency, that's everything that we're seeing, the demand. But and also at the same time decreasing the energy consumption and CO2 footprint, making the data center industry more sustainable, and by even reusing the heat regenerated by by the components. But therefore, the opportunity to be here today and discuss this with you guys is a great example for me to demonstrate the effort we are putting together through our OCP compatibility workstream, and also to bring this knowledge and also to bring this confidence and awareness, and also speed up this adoption, right, of this technology by the industry. So this is, I would say, in a few short words, how important is this for us? Okay, Jimmy.
Of course. So I have a question for Hussain, particularly from the end user perspective. Like, what level or depth of information would you like to see in the either document or database, whichever the format that we come up with? So like, what it also applies to, components, fluids, like what are the work packages or the I would say the chapters that you would like us to define for this work group?
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. That's a good question. And I can think of multiple important items. And maybe we can start with really clear and unified test sequence to certify a component or a system, a server altogether, with one-phase or two-phase technologies, hydrocarbon or PFC technologies. And again, like, I'm sure there will be a lot of common ground, but there will be a little bit of uniqueness to each one of them. So a testing sequence that really tells us how to qualify, instead of rerunning that qualification in lab kind of thing, but having a uniform sequence and that is shared with us, with OEMs, ODMs, and component manufacturers. And I hope that really the summary of it is, or the output of it is, a stamp on a component or a stamp on a system that says the system will work in immersion, has been qualified for these flavors of immersion, it works. I think that's a big thing for us. Another important item I can think of is also, because this is an incumbent technology, this is a coming technology, and we need the supply chain to be ready for it. I think it's important to have the manufacturers, the OEMs, the ODMs, the component suppliers be involved, and also their technical folks in their labs to be involved, because their labs will need some additional infrastructure, some tank setup, these little things that can enable their lab to get on board with the certification program.
Great. So just to add in that, Rob, would you like to, because the biggest challenge is there are so many components in a server, right? As Hussain said, that they would like to have all those certifications included in the database. Like there are so many components in bill of material, and it's very hard to taste all the components, as well as, it's very hard to, because sometimes component supply changes, the material formation changes, and it's again, you have to taste for all those components for everything to assure that certification. So how can we address those things in the database?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? If you look at a system board, there's thousands of components on a server motherboard. So I think, we need some sort of method to analyze those, right? So if you think about, the initiative years ago around lead-free, right? We had to go certify every component to be, lead-free, and understand what our component engineers work with those companies to understand, what materials are in each component. So we may have to have some sort of an effort like that, to where, we get component engineering engaged with our vendor base to understand what materials do your components make up. And if we have that, list of incompatible materials, maybe that helps us narrow things down to, or be able to ask the right questions to the component vendors, where we say, okay, do your components include these XYZ materials? And if so, you can classify your component as being, if they don't include those materials, then they can classify themselves as being compliant. But like Phil said, I think we do have to have that cross-reference of not just the components and the fluids, with the components and their materials, and the materials that we're bringing into the tank and how those interact as well. So there may be a larger list of materials, but I think seems like it's going to be a very large undertaking to develop and get all of the component manufacturers on board with this, right? You think about not only the number of components, but the number of vendors out there. It's
Yep, that's a great point. We need to create the ecosystem, and we need to have the pre-screening of materials as well as the cross effects. So now we have a couple of questions from the community. I have my PhD advisor, Professor Dr. Dereja Agnofer from University of Texas at Arlington, and I guess he's also on the line. So Professor, would you like to ask your question directly to the panelists by unmuting yourself?
Yes, I can do that.
Perfect.
So I wrote it. So as you guys know, that the complement to Moore's law is heterogeneous integration, right? And the frequency between nodes is now 5-6 years and so on. So in the interim period, you're using 2.5D and 3D packaging to leverage performance. So how much of an impact, and I really consider then thermal as a subset of packaging, really. And how much of an impact will this make moving forward to really start looking at liquid cooling, whether it's certainly immersion probably makes a lot of sense, especially as it's dielectric and so on. But is there a push, and are data center people aware of it? Because there's no discussion about performance and where that's going related to heterogeneous integration. And the second question I have, sorry, you mentioned how many material compatibility studies we need to do. It makes a lot of sense, and we spent quite a bit of time here at the university also working on that. Does it make sense to start working with academia on material compatibility? Because really, certainly, graduate students are a good resource to do stuff like that. And we have done a lot also published as well. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Agrafar, for asking great questions. So first question, I would like to ask Rob for the system level OEM and ODM perspective, and then Hussain for the data center perspective. So yeah, we'll start with Rob. Maybe there are so many questions for you, Rob, today. Sorry.
That's okay. No, packaging I think plays a huge role, right? As we've looked at DLC, the density of the systems that are desired, especially in the high performance computing space, are a challenge to apply, direct liquid cooling to, with a cold plate. And that's from a mechanical perspective, right? How do you cool DIMMs with a cold plate, and in the densities that we see, in our systems that we're designing, and then how do you scale that to more and more packages and within the system? And customers are requiring higher heat capture, so they want to, we want to be able to put DLC across all of the components in our system and capture as much heat as we can. But from a cost and complexity standpoint, you can't always do that, right? You can't fit the tubes in between a lot of the components. You can't physically, touch every component in the system. And so I think immersion is a great opportunity to address those challenges, right? The mechanical complexity goes away nearly completely, and it opens up for the ability to be able to do more even denser packaging, and you get the advantage of 100% heat capture to the fluid, so that you can either reuse that heat in your data center in your facility, or then pack more density into your racks. So I think immersion is a great technology to address the multiple packaging and cooling constraints.
Great, thank you, Rob. So Hussain, maybe you can also answer the second question and also provide your feedback on the first question. We are running on time, so I still have 2 questions after that. So if you can answer very quickly in 2 minutes.
Sure. I think the way to look at this is from the chip side and also from the data center side. And really, it's kind of, you look at them both together at the same time. So yes, I mean, going into immersion, going into this kind of technology, it will enable higher flux chips. It will enable closer integration of your compute and your memory. And as Robert mentioned, going into 100% heat pickup ratio using cold plates is a challenging task to achieve. But then all the complexity goes away with immersion, and then you end up with 100% heat pickup ratio systems that you are able to pack very tightly. And then from the data center side, because you're at 100% heat pickup ratio, then you can operate, warm water conditions. You don't need to use water. Water as a resource is a big deal. So eliminating the use of water for evaporative cooling, that's super important. So yeah, that's my answer.
And if you can also add about the collaboration with the academia, because we are coming from the same background, right? And Microsoft is also a part of a couple of consortiums. So yeah, please.
Certainly, yeah. I think there's a lot of great work been done in academia about material compatibility, qualification, a lot of testing, and I think it's one of the ways to accelerate getting to this matrix of qualified material and tests.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So Eduardo, don't worry, we are not gonna let you go. So as fluid supplier, as a fluid manufacturer, could you share on the efforts to mitigate and overcome any compatibility challenge from your side? And if you can also give an example, just like Phil provided that carbon filtration and some substrate extraction methods. You also showed about some soak taste methods and like that. But can you please give some examples and the solutions of those challenges?
Yeah, sure, Jimmy. And I think this question is also great and connects very well with the comment from Hussain and also Rob and also the professor, because I can give an example also from our side of how we are working. So we work with multiple strategic partners and companies around the world, right? And not only as we saw in the previous presentation from Rob, for example, we work with Asperitas, where we co-engineer our fluid, and also they perform multiple certification tests also for us and also in different projects. So this is one way, or let's say one view to attack this, I would say, this compatibility, let's say, challenge as well. And then they have a multiple deployments up and running. So and also the certification process they provide, and also I would say in our fluid, or let's say taking example, gel, GTL, hydrocarbon, it's giving the customer the confidence about the system will run properly. So this is one front, but also with IT manufacturers, right? We work very close with some specific tests running in our fluid, and also under totally different conditions, accelerated, aging, and also extreme high temperatures. But we're also going further. So we are also, I would say, and also work with the polymers and compounders, the material suppliers in collaboration for testing and evaluation their materials for immersion applications. Because as we mentioned before, the technology is quite new, right? And then we are kind of adopting in some way components used in air cooling, used to be air cooled, but now these companies, not only the IT components, the compounds, I mean, the companies providing the raw material for the components is also very interested in this, right? And be prepared for this. So that's why this is, I see as a different layers or fronts that we work together and across the industry, I would say, through our collaboration. And then those material polymers companies, they are very keen to work with us to identify any materials for immersion, for example, using our GTL synthetic hydrocarbon. So they are available in the industry, avoid any surprises during the operation or when they deploy, when they design a component. So it's already coming with a level of, as Hussain and Rob mentioned, it's a level of certification already, or a confidence that this will work properly fine. So this is, I think, is the beauty of the work we're doing in this collaboration. And also and through this collaboration, as you asked, I mean, about the challenge, I can mention like one example where we're able to identify the challenge on compatibility in advance, like for example, the EPDM elastomers. It's a null challenge for synthetic hydrocarbons. And then we help the suppliers to develop these alternative polymers or compounds which are more compatible with the fluid. So as you mentioned, I mean, there are different challenges when you look at different technologies, single phase, two phase, but we are engineers, right? We like to solve problems. So this is the beauty of being prepared for this and this adoption, and then helping, let's say, the industry to grow in this. And also, of course, as also mentioned, I think a very important point, I mean, aiming a very safe environment. I mean, with its paramount for Shell and for the operation as well. A very, to commit with all the specifications to the system design. So this is where I think we are really getting prepared and working, and also with OCP and multiple partners around the world. In academia, as you mentioned, is also a possible way. We actually do a lot of this as well, but for the time being, we are focused on these strategic collaborations. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much. Great. Thank you so much, Eduardo. I really appreciate your feedback. So we still have a couple of questions from the community that I will be forwarding to the panelists, and because due to the time limitations, we will move to the next session. So that's all the time we have. but we encourage you to attend the other ACS Advanced Cooling Solutions sessions. I would like to thank all the panelists, and I will forward you all the questions. We have some questions from Sion, from MI Materials. We have questions from Andy Young and Professor Ignofer again. So I will forward those questions to you, and I will forward your responses to them. So, yep. Thank you so much, all the panelists, and thank you all, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Greetings
Thanks,
from
guys.
Hamburg. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Rolf, over to you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Rolf.
Thank you to Jamil and our panelists. Next, we're going to take a quick break for about 15 minutes and reconvene at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. Encourage you all to check out some of the other sessions. There's also a meditation break sponsored by Facebook that you can access in the lobby if you'd like to participate in that. Thanks, everyone.